Hi, welcome to week 3. So again, we're going to keep this very informal and we're going to try and do it in one take. So we're going to start off, without further ado, with a question for Tom and all of us about lateen sails. And so this is from Charles Vega, who said, I find it interesting that a simple method of changing the sail shape existed, that they could head to within 60 degrees of the wind, and this is fascinating. Was this technology available to medieval ships, and is it lost technology? So what do you think, Tom?
So medieval ships, at least in Northwest Europe, sailed with square sails. So Viking ships, but also medieval cogs, for example, and medieval abstract ships had square sails. It's a common understanding that square sail ships could not sail against the wind. However, from reconstructions of Viking ships and of cogs in Germany, we've learned that they can actually sail against the wind. And even though cogs are reportedly very unwieldy vessels to sail, and the way that they sail against the wind is very inefficient when tacking them, they probably still waited for favourable winds to carry them along. But I think most of us have sailed in Viking ships over the years. So what are your experiences with sailing in Viking ships?
Well, sailing the Viking reconstructions in Roskilde in Denmark is really interesting because the way you can manipulate the square sails means that you can sheet in a way where they're actually better sailing to windward than you would imagine. And you can get somewhere quite close to 60 degrees at an angle to the wind, although you can't tack them very well per se. You have to wear them around, which is what we would call today a modern jibe, really.
Yeah, and things like the bow line make a really big difference to the sail shape. So there's a lot of this, as exactly as you say, about controlling sail shape to get you into the wind. So it's very easy to think that people are a bit simple in the past, but definitely not the case.
I think some of the questions also touched on the Red Sea. So Esther.
Well, yeah, it's true that people preferred good wind to sail predominantly from northwest. And we also know that people were sailing upwards the Red Sea towards north, and so we know they were sailing upwind all the time. So it was possible, and they were very advanced, actually.
Actually, can I just pick up on
Yeah.
that? Because we had a question as well at the end of last week from Astrid, and she asks, what do mariners do when they got blown off course? And I think this actually ties in quite nicely. So it's worth maybe having a little chat about that as well. And so I was thinking when you were saying that, obviously you have to be able to understand how the boat's going to react and how you're going to drift and what your heading is. So you're heading over the ground, but you're heading over the water as well. And obviously tide and current is quite important in that as well. So obviously ancient seafarers did end up going off course, but it's really, really vital that they knew where they were and how they could calculate to get back on course or calculate the new headings.
Well, I think landmarks are very important at that time, especially not just we know that people didn't just sail along the coast, they also ventured further out, but regarding coastal sailing, landmarks are very important. Reefs, certain discoloring of the water, for example, or birds, to be simple, sun, whatever. There's
And the
so
stars,
many,
of course.
and the stars, of course, yeah.
There's
There's
some
so
sort of mental mapping.
Yeah.
right. It's very nice.
It's actually, it's really interesting because there are different systems for understanding the world and how these, how it all works together. And in Polynesia and Micronesia with the attack system, they understand the route of where they're heading based on the stars and the wind and the birds and the patterns of the waves.
And the waves, yeah.
And the waves
Yeah,
as well.
yeah.
But they understand that the boat is stationary and the world is moving past them, apart from when they're blown off course or when they're pushed off course, in which case they understand that the boat is then moving in their world, in their constructive world. So it's a very, very different way of understanding just the world and the environment. But it was successful, as we can see by the vast distances covered.
Plus the high level of knowledge of the underwater landscape that people had
Yeah.
in medieval times. It was sounding that did most of the
Way
navigation.
before,
Yes.
even.
But also, for example, it's been said that Inuit people would carve out the three-dimensional shape of underwater surfaces in wood in order to navigate on them. So people knew the underwater landscapes very well.
I also think, as one of my favourite things that comes out of the ETAC system is that we worry because our world's so well mapped in many ways, we really worry about the precision, how well you know where you are. One of the nicest things about some of the other navigational systems that we encounter in the anthropological record is the use of imaginary places as reference points, places that no one had ever been to, that never existed, but there as a mental construct to help you realise how you should move and to give you that sort of sense of space and confidence in a really quite challenging environment. So yeah, I think there's some brilliant things, but just different ways of viewing the world as well, which may not have worried about knowing exactly where you are in the same way that we do. So that leads us on to, in a straight segue, onto our next question, which is from Alistair Mellor. And I'm going to address this to Tom because of some of his experience. Talking about changes in sea levels and landscapes effectively. And he's saying that there have been significant anthropogenic changes in terms of reclaimed land. And do we actually have many land-based shipwrecks now? So in reclaimed land, do we find ships that were sunk that are now on land?
Yes, we do, and you find a lot of them. For example, in the Flevopolders and then the Netherlands, I think it's an example that you gave yourself, and it is by far the best example. There's about, on estimation, 450 shipwrecks that are documented in the Flevopolders, 80 of which have not been excavated yet, but each year 1 or 2 are reported again, so the number keeps going up. And each year again also a shipwreck is excavated by a colleague of ours, André van Olk, under the guise of the International Field School for Maritime Archaeology, which is a really good training ground for coming to grips with ship construction, but also excavation of shipwrecks on land. But there should be as many in England, really, where more due to natural processes. For example, in the Camber, we have a lot of wrecking events that were documented of ships sailing towards Winchelsea and Rye. So there we could actually find a lot of shipwrecks on land as well.
Brilliant. Okay, in which case, I appear to be asking questions, but anyone else is welcome to. So we're going to move on to Kristin Skates, who asked a really good question, actually, and it's one that lots of people asked and asked in the previous run of the route, which is, I hope this isn't a silly question, which it certainly isn't, but in the video it mentions that the volume of seawater being affected. How is it measured? So how do we know about changing volume of seawater used to sea? So anyone like to answer?
Well, I guess I can start by saying that if this is something you're really interested in, it might be worth having a look at the Oceans MOOC, because there's a lot of information that goes into greater depth on that as well. But in addition to that, I guess the quick answer would be that it's very difficult, that there's a certain amount of complexity. So when we're thinking about the paleogeography of an ocean basin, we've got to look for proxies, so for evidence of where the sea level was. So we use things like rock cut notches and the coral and things like that to try and get an idea of the sea level. And then we can calculate the volume by knowing the depths. But obviously today it's done with very modern methods, looking at satellite altimetry as well.
Absolutely. So there's a lot of work done on this, also using radar to help measure elevations that go through. But you're right in terms of the really nice thing is the corals, as Helen said, because they're quite specific as to where they like to live. And so you can chart them in terms of whether they're raised and exposed now, or whether they're submerged and too deep to be growing. And so by dating when these changes occurred, you get a good proxy.
I guess the other thing that's worth considering, obviously for this course as well, really important for dating those sea levels, is the archaeology that we get on the coast. And one really good example of that are the wells at Atlit Yam on the coast of Israel, because we know that they're freshwater wells and now they're submerged. So we can get a very good idea of where the coastline is from there.
Absolutely. Yeah. Okay, so Crystal, then, moving forward, there's a really interesting question here about the complexity of the data. So we get to show off lots of very shiny images of sort of seismic interpretation. And there's a question here saying, does Southampton use the Cray computers at Bracknell for seismic interpretation, or do we have our own?
Well, we do have our own supercomputers, but to be honest, the power and processing power of computers nowadays is quite we can do all the work that we do in seismic interpretation and processing using just normal computers, but with very good processing units. And yeah, so we don't really use the supercomputers unless it's a big volume of data and we need to run it for several days.
Lovely.
Yeah. Is that your question now next, Fraser? Do you want me to?
It can be. You can pick a question. Go on, Crystal. Pick a question.
Okay, so a question by Valerie Naylor. Are submerged worlds protected from, for example, the placing of wind turbines or oil rigs? If a developer discovers archaeological remains during exploration, are they obliged to report them? And if so, are archaeologists given a time window in which to assess the site, or can a preservation order be placed on it as on land?
So this is a really good question, and it actually ties into one that Astrid Nyman-Jorgensen asked as well about the same sort of thing. And it does vary across the globe in terms of what different countries' legislation is and how they implement this. But for large parts of the world, especially across Europe and in North America as well, we have a system of environmental impact assessment, and it has been brilliant for archaeology. The majority of the archaeology, certainly in Europe, isn't actually done in universities. We're relatively small in terms of the number of people, but it's done in commercial context ahead of developments like this. So absolutely, we do have surveys that are run to identify archaeology, to work out what the impact would be, and the work that we'd need to do to mitigate against that. And so it's a really good opportunity for us to learn about the past, because we're actually doing more and more survey work offshore because of construction and development, which allows us to identify these sites and engage with them. So quite a few of us actually do this as a joint hat. So lots of us working in the university do both commercial work because it gives us access to these resources, as well as straightforward academic research. So absolutely we do. And also the major sort of bodies, so in Britain, Historic England, take a very active interest, and they have an engagement in this process. And if anything of supreme importance or significance is identified, then there are methods via which it may be protected, mostly to do with shipwrecks and aircraft. Submerged landscapes are a trickier thing, but we're doing better engaging with them through the core records as well. So yes.
Yeah.
So we'll move on then to a very different question, which is come in saying, when talking of hand axes and the like found in river gravel deposits, is it possible then that these early peoples made offerings to their gods, as has been found in much later sites such as Flag Fen? And I should say Flag Fen is a site in East Anglia in Britain, which is an amazing causeway out into a wetland environment where people in the Bronze Age built this platform and threw things off the edge. So it's a good question to ask. Any answers? I suppose everyone's holding back because it is quite a tricky thing.
Yeah.
So go on, Esther.
Well, like I said, it's tricky to answer because we tend to interpret such finds with like bended axes or swords always as ritualistic and offerings. Honestly, in most cases, we just don't know. It's a good guess. But it makes sense in later times, like in the Viking Ages, because you find bogs and rivers and even full boats, like canoes full with destroyed weapons and swords. So it makes sense it's an offering to some god or maybe a war booty, whatever, this way. With going further back in time, especially in river gravel deposits, it could have been a natural effect on the weapons itself. It could have been an offering. It's just really hard to tell, I think, personally. I don't know, what do you think?
It's really, really difficult. And trying to understand something as ambiguous as ritual offerings or by mentioning, I guess, gods, you're thinking about religion. And when we start thinking back in time to the Paleolithic, we really just don't know. So when we're finding caches of hand axes, I guess sometimes they could be there naturally, sometimes it's because they've been part of a site or they've been grouped together, stored or something like that. Sometimes it's just because that's where people were and they were participating in activities.
And absolutely, you mentioned the river gravels, and this is a key part of the context for where a lot of these are found. There's been a lot of work done on this because we do have this issue of whether they're derived, so whether we're finding where they're deposited or because of changes in sea level and changes in energies in rivers. These are actually to do with sites which have been eroded out and the material has been collected and carried downriver. And because of its side, it drops out from suspension under particular conditions, and we find them at those locations. Now, it's quite possible, such as that we've seen at Area 240, where we don't have a lot of rolling on these, that they're actually coming either they're in situ or close to being in situ. So we do have some finds from these sorts of contexts which indicate they're very close to where the point of origin, but we have others which have clearly travelled further distances. So it's a complicated record.
But having said that, people in the past did do odd things.
Yeah, absolutely.
like throwing hand axes off into water or in.
Yeah.
So who knows? I think is the answer.
Well, we still today throw coins in a well
Yes.
for good
Yeah.
luck. You know, you could. It's not the same, but you know, it's
I,
kind
I think the key thing was there is we don't know, and that is what really makes it interesting. But what we can do is we can talk about context is one of the things we picked up. So where are we finding these materials, and how can we explain how they got there? So do we understand that it's been affected by fluvial action, and did that fluvial action kick off at a particular point in time, or are we finding them in still water areas which are close? So this is where the sedimentology, effectively the geomorphology of the site becomes so important. And this is what make people like Rob Hosfield, if you want to read some nice papers on this, and Francis Webber-Smith, very, very happy to engage with. Okay, so that actually brings us on to our final point, really, I think, from today, and that's just to reassure, hopefully, lots of people, because there's been a lot of comments on the Richard Montgomery, because it is a very interesting site and it's a very dramatic story. And so I suppose I'd like to say there is a lot of research being done, and Amelia's engagement has been with this as part of that, is in terms of trying to understand or helping understand what's going on with the site through time. So don't have the impression that it's being an afterthought, but actually it's very, very closely monitored site with a lot of research going into it, and it's actually been very productive in terms of how we think about it. Some of the questions have actually moved away from the Montgomery and said, what about other wrecks from the world wars which may be carrying large amounts of ammunition? And this is certainly an issue, but actually the thing that people are being more concerned about recently is the potential fuel that have been on board vessels that have sunk, and corrosion rates, and what that might mean in terms of ecological impacts if those fuel tanks corrode and release their materials. Lots of them were pumped off, but there may be. So there's been work done trying to quantify that too. So the Montgomery is an amazing story, but it is one that is very closely monitored by a range of agencies. Okay, well, in which case, that's been the end of our questions. As ever, if you do have more questions next week, do please put them on the comments board, and we try to make sure we pick up on the ones which are possibly harder to answer in the space of Future Learn. And as you'll see, we don't always know the answer. So, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.